Well, thank you, Phil. Thanks for having me again. And that is a bit of a mouthful, so I've shortened it on the slide, just saying AI task cards and how to share AI tasks. Now, I do have quite a lot to cover. So I've put in a link in the chat to my slide, so you can follow along. And also, I there's a link to some additional resources. And if you want to see the slides quickly, get at a glance, you can go to the view and then choose grid view in Google Site. It's a PowerPoint, but I found that Google Drive is a really good way to share it. So to introduce myself, my name is Dominik Lukasz. I work at the Center for Teaching and Learning, and I run the Reading and Writing Innovation Lab. And I've been sort of looking into AI since before ChatGPT as one of the tools for thinking about supporting reading and writing, both for students and academics. And then in October, over the last year, I've been doing a lot of work, and I wrote this report called Beyond ChatGPT, which I'm right now updating because times have moved on since then. And this is part of that. This framework is about the culmination of the last year of me trying to figure out what do we mean when we say AI literacy. So we have those reasonably famous by now Russell Group principles that I'm not going to read through them, but there are 5 of them. And the second one says the staff should be equipped to support students to use generative AI tools effectively and appropriately in their learning experience. But what does that mean, right? What does that equipment of the staff, of all of us, look like? So I've started working last summer at what I'm calling this AI practitioner competence framework, and that's the second link that I've shared in the chat, so you can have a look at that. And I was kind of thinking, what are the different modes of engagement? Again, I'm not going to talk about that right here, just going to showing you what it's about, and thinking about what sort of what does it mean to be good at something? What's the quality of performance? You know, what are the mental models that we have to have? What is the sort of response to change? So this is kind of what the framework looks like. And again, I'm not going to go through the details, and you can go have a look at it, and I definitely welcome comments. But none of that answers the question, right? The what question. What does it actually mean? So what do we need to know when we are thinking about using AI in academic practice? So I've been working with students and academics over the last year in great detail, both sort of in groups and individually. And I've been trying to answer that question for myself, for them, in all different contexts. And one of the inspirations for this was this idea of the jagged technological frontier, which essentially comes from the problem of not being able to tell ahead of time what AI will be good at. And it comes from this paper that came out in September based on some research with consultants, and they've realized that they don't always know what they can expect AI to be good at. So they suggest that AI creates a jagged technological frontier where some tasks are easily done by AI, while others, they look similar in difficulty, but they're outside of current capability. And this is the illustration of that difficult paragraph. Essentially, the dotted line means those are the things that we think are tasks of similar difficulty, whereas the jagged line is the actually AI. So we see some things that we think are very similar are actually outside, whereas some things are very or that are different are inside. So there are some examples. So for example, we see that AI can speak any language more or less grammatically, but it cannot really label grammar terms very well. It can explain E equals MC squared, but cannot multiply numbers. It can write a poem, but it can reverse a random string of letters. So things that perhaps they look to us, you know, similar difficulty, or sort of one of them even easier, but some of them are more difficult for AI. So this means that people have different experiences of AI and so on. So people everything they've tried with AI is outside the frontier of expectation, but inside the frontier of capability. They think AI or ChatGPT is amazing. There's nothing it cannot do. And then people who've tried everything and it was inside the frontier of expectation, outside of AI capability, they have the opposite experience. And of course, we can also sometimes find these islands of competence. So sometimes, you know, there's things that AI is generally not good at, but it can be bad at. So for example, my experience is people are asking, why does ChatGPT give me wrong references? And I say, don't use it for references, it hallucinates them. But then I've talked to students, tell them, don't use it for references. But one student says, every time I've asked for a reference, it was right when I checked it. So we have these sort of, and then actually research shows that it's about, depending on the model, it can be anywhere between 18 to 55% of references hallucinated. So how do we deal with all of these issues? So the second inspiration here is something called Model Card, which is what Google introduced, I think, in 2020. And essentially the idea is that every time they release an AI model, they will always explain all the limitations, what went into training, what are the capabilities, and so on. So I wanted to build on this idea, and I came up with this idea of an AI task card. So how do every task that we want to use with AI, we should be able to answer 5 questions about the capabilities. And these are the 5 questions. So the first one is AI suitability. Is it AI suitable in general? Is it a good match for the task? And second, how much of a problem is hallucination? Is it manageable? Where is it likely to show up? Then how is it sensitive to the prompt? Is it important how it is formulated? Then the next one is it dependent on the context window? So can the AI actually see everything we presented for the task that we're trying to use? And finally, how important is it that we choose a particular tool? Is any tool good at this, or is there one that's more difficult? So I sort of have this this framework that for every time that I want to think about, do I want to use AI? I sometimes in my head, and when I share it, I do it on paper, go through answer these questions. So, and it's really important because of the jagged frontier, is that we need to think about very specifically about the specific task, not necessarily in general. So here are some tasks that we've worked at, like feedback on academic writing. What is the other support? What is the actual task in general? What is the specific nature of it? Coding, clarifying concepts while reading, organizing, planning projects. What is the type of work, and so on. So there's always these things we need to answer. So let's go through a quick worked example of what that could look like when we talk about the summarization of academic papers. And so is AI suitable for that? And so we know AI has these big 4 capabilities. I've always talked about generative AI, text comprehension, image comprehension, speech recognition, speech generation. And I always like to say it's really good idea to think of it as a universal translator between languages, between styles, from structured to unstructured, from unstructured to structured, and so on. Even question answering is really sort of a translation from a question to answer. If we look at these capabilities, then we can think of that actually is quite relevant to summarization. It can translate from a longer text to shorter text. But of course, we also know there are those famous big limitations, hallucination and unpredictability, which mean hallucination, we get something that's plausible but not real, or something that's unpredictable, we get a different result every time. So we need to be aware of that when we think about summarization of academic papers. So first, it's highly suitable. It's exactly what this is best at, but it's important to remember the caveats. And that takes us to the next step. So hallucination, we know that's a problem for AI. So how much is it a problem here? So there are sort of 3 levels. Sometimes it doesn't matter at all when we're asking for poetry. Sometimes it matters a little bit for translation, sort of conceptual questions where we have an easy way of checking. And sometimes for calculating math, doing multiplication, it's virtually unusable. It's not really what we should be using it for. So we know it's not always sometimes it's a problem, not always. So for example, if I wanted to ask to write a limerick, then we will see that doesn't particularly matter. And it's really, when we work on conceptual ideas such as summarization, then that actually is very often easy to check. And so it's perhaps not as much of an issue. So let's have a look at that. So here's a summarize. We're asking to summarize a paper, or in this case, I asked it to give me something about people who were mentioned in the paper, and then this did a decent job, but I wanted more, and then it gave me more, and all of a sudden it gave me people who could have been mentioned in that kind of paper because they're it was a paper about that sort of thing, but none of them were. So we see that there is a hallucination problem. Now, so it's not all of it, but there's some of it. So sometimes it says things that are true and could be in the text, but not in the text. Sometimes you can misquote the text. So it's kind of a medium issue. They have to be worried about it. Now, next question, how important is the context window for the summarization? So I'm going to say, so what is the context window? So first is your prompt plus everything the model generates plus any background instructions that may be happening. So every new thing that is generated is part of the context window. So that actually turns out was the problem in this case. Because the article was too long, the ChatGPT in this case couldn't see all of it, so it started hallucinating because actually it stopped seeing what's in it. Whereas if I use a bigger model that has a bigger context window, which was in this case GPT-4, it completely succeeded at this. There's no problem, no hallucination. It could give me really detailed information about it. So it's important to think about context windows. So the free version of ChatGPT has about 3,000 words, the paid version about 12, and the Claude from Anthropic has 120,000. So for example, if I ask Claude to summarize a PDF, it will give me a lot of detailed information. So in this case, we see that the sort of context window dependence is very high for summarization. Now, Sorry, I realize I'm slightly out of order, but in the slide. So do prompts matter for paper summarization? That's the way I formulate the prompt, right? And we never quite know how it is important. So I always sort of think there are 3 practical prompting lessons. We should be give examples, specify the style, the format, the steps, and then specify personas. Things that don't matter is things like spelling, punctuation, word order. But what matters is things like examples, perspectives, and style. Right? And also structured display makes it easier to check errors. So for example, I can ask, not just summarize it, but give me a list of propositions. So I get a nice, and then I show it in a table. So this is an example of the prompt. It wasn't just the prompt itself, but also how I asked, what I asked for. The other useful thing to know is long prompts that suggest structure the best. So we could see earlier, this is my prompt that I use for summarization of papers with Claude. So I give it list of headings it needs complete, and that actually gives me good answers. So prompt sensitivity is medium. If I just say summarize, it gives me something. But if I use a prompt with structure and some iteration, I get best results. And finally, does the tool or the model matter for article summarization? And so there are loads and loads of web products. There's 50, these are the 50 most common. There are different categories. And so often, there's this beautiful landscape of AI out there, but sometimes it feels a bit swampy. And then, of course, all of these things have a similar building block. So they're all built on some foundation models. So, and then the products and features are designed based on the model. So we need to think about the features as well as the model. So for example, we have these big 4 providers of chatbots, like ChatGPT, and they have a free version and a paid version. They all use a different model, and it's important to think about what that model is. But of course, sometimes that model is being used by an app. So here's a really good app for summarizing papers, working with papers, called SciSpace, and it has many nice features. But it's I can ask it a question, and it will summarize this paper that I've uploaded. But of course, it costs. There's a free tier, but if I want to use it more, there's money. But of course, what happens if I go to Claude and ask it with this detailed prompts about these things, the same paper upload, and I actually get very similar results. Now, it doesn't mean SciSpace is useless. It just means it has other nice features, but I have to make that decision. What is the benefit? And of course, I know that I have to use something that has a long context window. So in this case, I will always choose Claude for that, right? So I always say, when in doubt, use the chatbot, except sometimes consider one of these others for a reason. So for example, for literature search, I know there was discussion in the chat, you may want to go look into at Elicit. So that will kind of give you a nice summary of multiple papers in a table form. You still have those issues with hallucination, other issues, but it's a good way for doing a quick first pass literature review. If you're trying to summarize videos, you may want to use like Jamworks, or you can again use Claude for these. So essentially that gives us completes this paper. So the dependence on the variability across tools is quite high. So some chatbots don't quite summarize papers. Some tools like Elicit, SciSpace may specialize, but not have the context window in the free tier. So that's kind of the example. So you can feel free to use these.
Sorry, if you could start to wrap up, because we've got to move on to the next speaker.
I am actually now finished. So essentially, if you go to that link, you will see, you can sort of download the presentation, some more details. There's some even more details. And then, of course, including, you can create yourself a little sort of a grid of tasks. And that is kind of where that ends. So all the resources are here. And of course, the slides as well. So I am now open to questions.
Thank you so much. Great slides and a great presentation. Unfortunately, Dominic, we've run into the question time. So I think there are some questions in the Q&A, but if you do have a question for Dominic, can you please post that in the Q&A so Dominic can have a look and he can answer that question. But please do use the links that were given. We'll repost those so they appear kind of a bit further down the list so you can access those. And thank you, Dominic, for sharing those resources. I think I can see a lot of people taking you up on that offer of having a look at those, and I think really, really important. So thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, and sorry for running over.
No, don't worry. I didn't want to cut you off because I thought it was actually really relevant. So it was good.